He thought he was alone in his own house. He was wrong. It started with a cold chill, a sudden, freezing wave that numbed his bones. Mark was fine a moment ago, laughing, happy. Then, the darkness hit. A wave of pure sadness washed over him, crushing his spirit. But why? He didn't know. The air in the room felt thick, like someone was standing right behind him, breathing, waiting. He turned around. Nothing. Only the ticking of the clock, and the sound of his own heart thumping, thumping. Suddenly, a surge of rage boiled in his blood. He wanted to scream, to break something. The anger wasn't his. It was coming from the corners of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch. They reached for him, like invisible fingers clawing at his mind. Is he going crazy? No. Something is feeding on him. A heavy, ancient malice is sitting in his chair, watching him suffer. He looked in the mirror, and for a split second, his reflection grinned. It wasn't a human smile. It was a trap. The haunting has begun, and the door is already locked. The air turned toxic. Mark tried to move, but his feet were heavy, like lead, dragging him into the floorboards. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was loud, high-pitched ringing, vibrating in his skull screeching. Who was in the hallway? No one, but the floorboards. They groaned, slowly, agonizingly. Someone was walking toward his door. Each step, a hammer to his nerves. Thud, thud, thud. The temperature dropped until he could see his own breath. A white, ghostly mist swirling in front of his face. Then, he felt it. A wave of hate, so strong it made him sick. It wasn't a ghost. It was a hunger, a dark, bottomless pit, reaching out to swallow his identity. He reached for the doorknob ice. It wouldn't turn. It wouldn't budge. A voice, no, a vibration, whispered in his ear, "You are mine now." His own hands began to shake, but he wasn't controlling them. They were reaching for his own throat, clawing. Is this a dream? He wished it was. The shadows on the wall, they weren't his shape anymore. They were taller, jagged, monstrous, waiting. The reflection in the mirror started to bleed. Black, thick oil, leaking from the glass. It was overflowing, coming for him, slowly, surely. The darkness in the room wasn't just empty space. It was alive. Mark backed away from the mirror, his breath coming in ragged, sharp gasps. The black oil was still leaking, dripping, onto the cold floor. Drip, drip, drip. Every sound felt like a shotgun blast in the silence. He tried to look away, but his eyes were glued to the glass. The reflection wasn't a man anymore. It was a void, a hollow, soul-sucking shadow that wore his skin, like a cheap suit. Suddenly, the lights didn't just flicker, they exploded. Glass rained down, tinkling on the floor, like frozen tears. Total, absolute, pitch black. He reached out his hands, feeling the air, searching for the door. But the walls, they felt different, cold, damp, and pulsating, like a beating heart. The house was breathing with him. He took a step, and the floor felt like mud. Something was grabbing his ankles, pulling him down. Who's there? He tried to scream, but the words were muffled. It felt like his mouth was filled with ashes. A sudden, piercing, sea-old wind blew through the closed window. It carried the smell of decay, old graves, and forgotten bitterness. Then, the whispering started again. But it wasn't just one voice. It was 1,000 voices, all screaming, all crying. They weren't outside. They were inside his head. Get out. Get out. Get out. The anger returned, 10 times stronger than before, falling into a dark, endless abyss. Mark felt the air, thin and freezing, rushing past his ears. But then suddenly he hit the ground. Thud. He wasn't in his room anymore. He was standing in a hallway that stretched for miles. The walls were lined with pictures, thousands of them, all of the same face. His face. But in every photo, he was crying, or screaming. In pure agony, the feeling of sadness returned. But this time, it was a tsunami. It crashed over him, drowning his lungs. He fell to his knees, gasping, choking on his own tears. "Why me?" he whispered into the void. The hallway answered with a growl. The pictures on the wall began to change. The eyes in the photos, they started to turn. Thousands of paper eyes, all locking onto him. They weren't just watching, they were judging. A sudden, violent rage exploded in his chest. He wanted to tear the walls down, to burn the world. He stood up, his fists clenched, until his knuckles bled. "I am not your puppet," he roared, but the hallway only laughed. A deep, distorted, demonic sound that rattled his teeth. Then, the floor began to vibrate. A shadow, taller than the ceiling, appeared at the far end. It didn't walk, it glided. Every step it took, the hallway behind it disappeared. The world was being erased. Closer and closer it came, a silhouette of absolute, pure hate. Mark tried to run, but the air turned to syrup. His legs moved in slow motion. The shadow was only inches away now. He could smell it. The scent of old blood and wet earth. He felt a cold, skeletal finger trace a line down his forehead. The touch felt like burning ice. "The door is open," the shadow whispered. But it wasn't the door to his house. It was the door to his soul. He felt himself slipping away. His memories, his name, his very identity. It was all being stolen. He looked down at his hands, and they were fading, becoming transparent, like a ghost. Was he the one who was dead, or was he just the next one? The shadow opened its mouth, and the entire universe went silent. A final, terrifying truth flashed in his mind. He wasn't being haunted by a ghost. He was being consumed. And then, the last light went out. The silence was different now. It was heavy, like a burial shroud. Mark opened his eyes, but he didn't see his room. He saw everything. The walls of the hallway were gone, replaced by a vast, gray mist, a sea of shadows, stretching into eternity. Thousands of figures, standing perfectly still in the fog. They were just like him, hollow, empty, faded. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. His voice was no longer his. He looked down at his chest and saw a flickering, golden light. It was tiny, like a dying candle. In a hurricane, the tall shadow stood before him, its faceless head tilting. It reached out, its long, spindly fingers, inches from the light. "Is this the end?" The city lights don't reach here, and once the sun sets, you are never alone. The Perth Girls Orphanage stands like a tomb, a monolith of brick and shadowed arches. In the daytime, it's just a historic building, silent, empty, a monument to lost childhoods. Tourists take photos, and locals walk past, oblivious to the rot beneath the surface. But as the sun dips below the horizon, the building shifts. The bricks seem to breathe, exhaling a cold, ancient sadness. Liam was the new night shift cleaner, a quiet man who just wanted to do his job. He didn't believe in ghost stories. He didn't care about the rumors, transfer requests, resignations. It's just people being paranoid. He told himself he was wrong. On his first night, the silence was normal, routine, mundane, just the sound of his mop on the stone floor and the distant hum of traffic. He was on the second floor, outside the old dormitories, near the great staircase. He stopped mopping for a moment, just to catch his breath, and that's when he heard it. In the stillness, a whisper, tiny, high-pitched, coming from the other side of the heavy wooden door. "Shh, she's coming." Liam's mop froze in his hand. His heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer. Thud, Thud. "Who's in there?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. No answer. But then he heard a sound that made his stomach drop. Giggle, giggle, giggle. Childish laughter, echoing. Multiplication, filling the hallway. 100 small voices, whispering, laughing. At him. He looked at the door, and saw the doorknob slowly start to turn. Creak. He dropped the mop, stumbling backward, his eyes wide with pure panic. The door slammed shut. Bang. The sound echoed through the entire building, like a gunshot. Then, complete and total silence. A single, ice-cold draft of air hit his face. He felt a hand, small, freezing, brush against his. But there was nitrogen monoxide one there. A single thought flashed in his mind, like a warning sign. The transfer requests. They weren't because of people being paranoid. He ran for the stairs, not looking back, not stopping until he hit the street. His reflection in a car window looked ghost-like. His first night was his last. Liam didn't go back, but the orphanage wasn't finished with him. He was sitting in his apartment, 3 miles away, gasping for air. The city sounds outside should have been comforting, but they felt distant, like he was underwater, drowning in a sea of gray mist. He looked at his hands. They were still shaking. It was just a prank, he whispered to the empty room. The wind, or a squatter, just a trick of the light. But then he smelled it. The scent of old wood and floor wax. And something else. The smell of dusty clothing. The exact smell of the second floor. Of the Perth Girls Orphanage. He froze. Tick, tick, tick. His wall clock seemed to grow, louder. Every second felt like a hammer hitting his skull. Then he heard a soft, wet sound. Slap, 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 small, bare feet, walking across his hardwood floor. But he was alone. He turned his head slowly, his neck muscles stiff with terror. There, in the corner of his living room, the shadows were. They weren't just dark. They were hollow. A small, pale shape began to form in the gloom. A girl in a white dress, standing perfectly still. Her hair was long, matted, covering her face like a shroud. Liam tried to stand, but his legs were water. "What do you want?" His voice was a pathetic, broken whimper. The girl didn't move, but the temperature in the room dropped. He could see his breath. A white. The room felt like it was shrinking. The walls of Liam's apartment were no longer drywall and paint. They were cold, red brick. The crimson light pulsed like a dying heart. Thump, thump, thump. He crawled toward the door, his fingernails tearing against the floorboards. But the hallway of his home was gone. In its place, a long, dark dormitory, stretching into infinity. Rows of small, iron beds lined the walls, and on every bed sat a figure, perfectly still, perfectly silent, watching him with vacant eyes. "This isn't real," Liam gasped, his lungs burning like he was breathing smoke. "I'm dreaming. I'm just tired." But the cold was very real. The girl in the white dress was only inches away now. He could see the grime on her hem, the gray ash on her skin. She didn't have a face, just a hollow darkness where her features should be. Slowly, she tilted her head, a sickening snap echoing in the room. "Why did you? R-U-N?" The voice was a chorus, 1,000 voices, screaming at once. Liam tried to stand, but the floor began to liquefy. His feet sank into black, oily muck. The smell of stagnant water and old graves filled his nose. He looked up, and the ceiling was covered in shadows. Hundreds of small, dark shapes, crawling like insects. They were dropping, one by one, onto the floor around him. Plop, plop, plop. He was surrounded. A circle of unsettled energies closing in. They weren't children anymore. They were hunger personified. I didn't do anything, he shrieked, his voice cracking like dry wood. The girl reached out, her hand touching his chest. It didn't feel like skin. It felt like burning acid. His shirt began to smoke right over his heart. He felt his memories being drained, his childhood, his mother's face, his own name, fading into the gray. The orphanage wasn't just a building. It was a vortex. It reached across the city, through the air, to pull back what it owned. And it owned anyone who stepped through its doors. Liam looked at his own reflection in the black oil on the floor. His hair was turning gray, his skin wrinkling. In seconds, he was aging. A lifetime. In a heartbeat, the girl whispered one final word into his ear. Stay. The lights went out. Absolute crushing darkness. Liam opened his eyes, but the darkness didn't leave. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. His back was against rough, cold stone. The air was thick with the smell of mothballs and ancient, stagnant dust. He tried to move, but his wrists were heavy. Iron shackles, rusted and biting into his skin, clinked against the wall. Clang, clang, clang. He wasn't in a dormitory. He was in the cellar, the hidden, forgotten depths of the Perth Girls Orphanage. A single, flickering candle sat on a wooden crate 10 feet away. The flame was blue. It didn't give off heat. It gave off ice. Help, he shouted, but his voice was thin, like a ghost's. The stone walls swallowed the sound. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Not the girl in the white dress, but something taller. A woman in a stiff black Victorian uniform. Her face was a mask of pure, steely. She held a heavy iron kai in her hand. Silence. She hissed, the sound like steam escaping a radiator. In this house, we do not scream. Liam felt a surge of inexplicable terror, deeper than anything before. This wasn't a haunt. It was a replay, a nightmare, looped in time for over 100 years. He looked down at his clothes. They were gone. He was wearing a ragged, gray smock. His hands were small. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. He whispered, "This isn't me." The woman stepped closer, the blue candle flaring brighter. The shadows on the wall began to dance. They weren't just shapes. They were memories, flickering images of hunger and loneliness. He saw the faces of hundreds of children trapped in the bricks. Their eyes were hollow, pits of despair. You wanted to clean, didn't you? The woman sneered. She handed him a bucket filled with black, oily water. Now scrub. Unto the history is gone. Liam grabbed the brush, his fingers bleeding from the rough bristles. He began to scrub the stone floor, but the more he worked, the more the blood seeped from the walls. It wasn't his blood. It was the orphanage's blood. The building was bleeding out its secrets. He felt himself slipping further into the past. His life as a cleaner was a fading dream. He was just another lost soul. In the cellar, suddenly, the blue candle went out in the pitch black. He felt hundreds of small cold hands touch his back. They weren't trying to hurt him. They were pulling him into the walls, into the bricks. Stay with us, they whispered. A chorus of ghosts. Stay, stay, stay. The woman's laughter echoed through the pipes. It was a sound of absolute victory. The darkness was no longer just a room. It was a sentence. Liam felt his body merging with the cold stone of the cellar. The small, freezing hands were no longer pulling him. They were becoming him. He was the brick. He was the dust. He was the archive. Suddenly, a flash of light, blinding white, cut through the gloom. It wasn't a candle. It was a flashlight. "Hey! Anyone in here?" A voice boomed, echoes bouncing off the damp walls. It was the new morning shift. The sun was rising. Liam tried to scream, to wave, to move a single finger, but he was paralyzed. He looked down, and he wasn't a man, or even a ghost. He was a stain on the floor, a shadow, burned into the concrete forever. The morning guard walked right, third Oyuja. Him. A wave of nausea and pure cold hit the guard. "Ooh, this place gives me the creeps," the guard muttered, rubbing his arms. He looked at the floor, where Liam's soul was, trapped. "Looks like a water leak. Or something else." The guard turned around and walked back up the stairs. Liam watched from the ground as the heavy wooden door slammed shut. Clack. The lock turned, and the light from the hallway vanished. He was left in the silence with the others. The woman in black stood over him, her face a mask of stone. "Good," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering. "The history is preserved." In the shadows, the girl in the white dress appeared. She picked up Liam's old, forgotten mop. She began to nub the floor in a perfect rhythmic circle. Swish, swish, swish. The sound filled the cellar. A heartbeat for a building that never dies. The Perth Girls Orphanage has a way of keeping what it finds. If you walk past those arches at night, don't look at the windows, because someone is looking back. For a replacement. The whispers never truly stop. Some doors are locked for a reason, and some buildings should never be disturbed. The mountain air was thin, biting, icy cold. Junho stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the concrete skeleton of the Gonjiam Hospital. It sat there like a rotting corpse, crumbling gray, dead. The windows were like hollow eyes, watching him from the darkness. "It's just an abandoned building," he whispered, his breath clouding in the moonlight. But his heart knew the truth. It was thumping against his ribs, thud, thud. He had heard the stories, the legends of the 1990s, patients dying in their beds for nitrogen monoxide reason, doctors vanishing into thin air, leaving their coats behind. The hospital didn't just close, it was exorcised. Junho took a step forward, the dead leaves crunching like bones under his boots. The heavy iron gate was rusted, sharp, like teeth. He pushed it open. Creak. The sound echoed through the valley, a warning from the past. As he stepped inside the lobby, the air changed. He didn't think so. He blinked, and the wheelchair moved just an inch. Squeak. His blood ran cold, freezing in his veins. "Who's there?" he called out, but the hallway only offered silence. Then, from the darkness of room 204, a sound emerged. A low, wet, scratching sound, like fingernails digging into the concrete. Junho gripped his camera, his knuckles white. A voice, a raspy, tortured whisper, drifted through the air. "Help me." But there was nitrogen monoxide one in the room. The shadows on the wall began to twist. They weren't shapes of furniture. They were shapes of people, dozens of them, reaching out from the bricks, clawing at the light. Junho tried to turn back, but the door he came through was gone. There was only a wall, cold, damp, and vibrating. The hospital was awake, and it was hungry. The flashlight flickered once, twice, then died. Junho was standing in total, crushing darkness. The air felt wet, like he was breathing in stagnant graveyard water. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was walking right behind him. The footsteps were bare and dragging. "Is anyone there?" he whispered, his voice cracking like dry ice. No answer. But then he felt a cold, skeletal finger trace a line down his spine. He spun around, hitting the wall, his heart thumping. Thud, thud. He shook the flashlight, hitting it against his palm. The beam snapped back to life, cutting through the gloom. And there, at the end of the corridor, was a figure, a patient, in a tattered, gray gown. The figure was standing unnaturally still. Its head was tilted, at an impossible angle. Snap! Junho didn't wait. He ran. His boots pounded on the cracked linoleum, echoing like a drum. He turned a corner, then another, but the hallway just kept going. The room numbers were muddled. "The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice." Every door he passed was the same room. He stopped, gasping for air, his lungs burning. Suddenly, the walls began to bleed. Black, thick sludge oozing from the cracks. It wasn't blood. It was pure darkness. The smell of formaldehyde and decay became overwhelming. Then, from the ceiling, a shadow dropped. It didn't have a face, just a gaping hole, a mouth that was screaming, but no sound came out. Junho felt a surge of sudden, unexplainable rage. He wanted to tear his own hair out, to claw at his skin. The hospital wasn't just haunting him, it was possessing him. "Get out! Get out!" he roared, but the shadow only grinned. It reached for his chest, its fingers cold as a winter grave. He felt his vision blurring, turning gray. Was he becoming one of them? A patient, lost in time. The floor beneath him began to vibrate, a deep, low humming coming from the basement. The power was on, but the hospital had been dead for 30 years. How? How is this? The elevator doors at the end of the hall began to slowly open. Ding! A pale white light spilled out, but inside was only a pile of bones, and they were moving. The elevator doors stayed open, a gaping, hungry mouth. Junho backed away, his heels clicking on the cold stone. The bones, they weren't just moving, they were assembling, one by one, clicking, snapping into place. It was a skeleton, but it was too tall. 7 feet, maybe more, its spine curving like a snake. It didn't have a head, just a cluster of rusted surgical needles where a skull should be. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of the metal hitting the elevator floor made Junho's teeth shatter with cold. "Stay away," he choked out, but his legs refused to move. Suddenly, the walls of the hallway began to shrink. The ceiling was dropping, inch by inch, crushing the air out of the room. The hospital was folding in on itself. He looked at the room numbers again. They were bleeding. "The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice." 204. A door to his left slammed open. Bang. Inside, he saw himself, another Junho, sitting on a hospital bed, staring at the wall with hollow eyes. The other Junho turned his head slowly, his skin gray as ash. "You're late for treatment." The voice was his own, but distorted, like a broken radio. Junho let out a piercing scream. He turned and dived into a dark stairwell. He didn't go up. He went down into the air here was thick with the smell of burning hair. The walls were covered in old yellowed charts. Every chart had his name on it. Every chart was dated. How? He wasn't even born then. Then he saw the incinerator. The massive iron furnace was glowing, a deep, angry orange light pulsing like a heart, and standing in front of it was the woman from the photo, the director, her eyes missing, just dark pits of pure agony. She held a scalpel in her hand. It wasn't metal. It was shrouded in a dark static energy. The souls are unfinished, she hissed. The floor beneath his feet began to melt. He was sinking into a pool of black liquid hate. The shadows in the basement started to sing a low guttural chant that made his brain bleed. He reached for the stairs, but they were gone. There was only the furnace and the darkness. The heat from the furnace was unbearable, but it wasn't a warm heat. It was a Diarway scorching, cold. Junho tried to scramble away, but the black liquid on the floor was clinging to his legs like thousands of tiny invisible mouths biting his skin. The woman in the black dress, the director, she didn't walk. She glided, her feet never touching the ground. Hiss, hiss, hiss. Every breath she took sounded like steam escaping a pressure cooker. You don't belong here, Junho gasped, his vision blurring into a dark vortex. The director stopped just inches from his face. The smell of formaldehyde was so strong he felt sick. Nobody belongs here, she whispered. That's why we never leave. Suddenly, the incinerator door slammed open. Bang. A wave of pure darkness poured out like a flood. It wasn't fire. It was shadows, thick and heavy. They began to unwrap around Junho's arms, his neck, his chest. He looked at the charts on the wall again, and they were changing. The dates were vanishing, replaced by today's date. And the cause of death? Fear. The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice. I'm not a patient, he roared, fighting against the crushing weight. But his hands, they were turning gray, his fingernails falling out one by one, hitting the floor with a tink, tink, tink. He looked into the director's hollow eyes, and for a second, he saw the 1990s. He saw the screams, the struggles, the unethical experiments. The hospital wasn't a place of healing. It was a harvest, and he was the new crop. Suddenly, a high-pitched screeching alarm went off. The sound of calling for an emergency. The red emergency lights in the basement began to pulse. Thump, dump, thump. The shadow man with the needles from the elevator was behind him now. He felt the first sharp sting in his shoulder. The world began to fade into a silent gray void. Is this the end, or just the beginning of his treatment? The sting in his shoulder felt like liquid ice spreading through his veins. Junho tried to scream, but his jaw was locked. The tall shadow man with the needles leaned over him, its metal face cold and rusted. Click, click, click. Sound of the surgical tools echoed in the silence. The director stood, watching, her eyeless pits glowing with a dull, hungry light. "The procedure is almost complete," she whispered. Junho looked at his own hands. They were fading into the gray mist. He wasn't a man anymore. He was becoming a smudge on the wall. Just another tortured soul for the archives. Suddenly, a flash of light from the far corner of the basement. His camera, lying on the floor. Its timer went off. Flash. The white light hit the shadows like a grenade. The director shrieked, her skin peeling like burnt paper. The shadow man dissolved into a pile of rattling needles. Junho felt the grip on his soul loosen just for a second. "The voice you selected does not support this language. Please click the upper right corner to switch to another voice." A voice, a child's voice, whispered in his ear. He didn't think. He didn't look back. He bolted. He scrambled up the stairs, his lungs burning with the smell of the hallway of room 204 was screaming. The walls were closing in, trying to crush him. He dove through the front doors, just as they slammed shut. Boom! He fell into the dead leaves, the cold mountain air hitting his lungs like a miracle. The sun was rising over the South Korean peaks.